My name is Mike, and I've always prided myself on being a straightforward, hardworking guy. For as long as I can remember, I believed in loyalty, honesty, and the sanctity of family. I built my life on these principles, working long hours at the auto shop, saving every dime, and dreaming of growing old together with the woman I loved. I never imagined that the very foundation of my world could be shaken by something as modern and as subtle as geolocation tracking data. I met Claire when I was in my mid-20s, and everything about her fascinated me. She had a magnetic charm, a way of lighting up a room with her confident smile and witty banter. At first, I thought she was a keeper, a partner who could match my steadiness with her vivacity. Our relationship started out like a fairy tale, late-night drives, spontaneous trips, and promises made under the starry sky that nothing in the world could break us apart. For years, I trusted her implicitly, even when my friends warned me that her sharp tongue and penchant for bending the truth could eventually lead to trouble. In the early stages, our life together was full of bright moments. We'd laugh over breakfast, plan our vacations on lazy Sunday afternoons, and support each other through the small struggles of day-to-day life. But, as it often happens in the real world, not everything is as perfect as it seems. I began to notice small inconsistencies, tiny shifts in her behavior that I tried to brush off as normal stresses of everyday life. It started with sporadic late arrivals from work, then evolved into unexplained absences on weekends. She'd often say she was meeting a friend for a quick bite or catching up on some errands, but her excuses were becoming too rehearsed, too predictable. I remember one particular evening when I was home alone, waiting for her return, that a sliver of doubt finally took root. I was sitting in our living room, flipping through channels on TV, when I noticed that her phone was buzzing incessantly on the kitchen counter. I did not mind her constant connectivity, but that night something felt off. Her texts were coming in rapid-fire succession, laden with details that didn't quite add up. The tone of her messages, a mix of laughter and hasty apologies, felt strangely insincere. Yet, I convinced myself it was just another one of her quirky ways of multitasking, not something that should disturb the trust one had built over the years. However, there were signs I couldn't ignore. Over time, I started to notice that her usual punctuality turned into unexplained delays. When I'd ask where she'd been, her responses were curt and laced with defensiveness. "I was just out," or "I had some stuff to do," were the typical replies, accompanied by that piercing, dismissive glance that always made me feel like I was being accused of some imagined wrongdoing. I began to wonder if I was overreacting, if my insecurities were getting the better of me. After all, she was always so confident, a real go-getter who never hesitated to take risks in her career. But now, it seemed that risk had taken on a more sinister form. Then came the day that would change everything. I'd installed a new app on my phone, a tracking app that I thought was harmless and practical, something to keep tabs on our shared vehicle for insurance purposes. I had no idea that this would soon become the key to unraveling secrets I never wanted to face. One lazy Sunday morning, while sipping my coffee and casually checking the app out of idle curiosity, I noticed a strange spike in her phone's geolocation data. It wasn't at the usual places she frequented, her gym, our favorite coffee shop, or the grocery store. Instead, the location data pinpointed an area on the edge of town I didn't recognize. I hovered over the map, and a chill ran down my spine as more anomalies started to show up. At first, I rationalized it as perhaps an error, a simple glitch in the system that misread her location. But as the days went by, the evidence mounted. The app's logs showed repeated visits to a location that was nowhere near any of her typical haunts. I started paying closer attention to her behavior. She'd become unexpectedly guarded about her phone, even going so far as to leave it behind on occasion or change her passwords without explanation. Her smiles, once warm and inviting, began to twist into something almost mocking whenever I casually mentioned the oddities I'd seen. There were moments when I caught her glancing at me, her eyes sparkling with a secret I wasn't privy to. And every time, I felt my gut twist in a painful knot of foreboding. I'm not a paranoid man by nature, far from it, but the certainty that came from technology was something I couldn't ignore. I started cross-referencing her whereabouts with our calendar events, phone calls, and even social media check-ins. Each detail added another layer to the disturbing puzzle I was inadvertently assembling. The pattern was undeniable, my wife was not where she claimed to be. And as the sun set on one long, sleepless night, the truth became clear even to my own reluctant eyes. I realized then that the life I'd built, a life of trust and unwavering belief in the love we shared, was built on a foundation of lies. The very tool I had installed for convenience had become the harbinger of my worst nightmare. I felt betrayed not only by her actions but by the way everything seemed so calculated, so meticulously hidden behind her sweet smiles and cleverly crafted excuses. I'd spent years believing that if something was amiss, I'd eventually sense it in my gut. Now, that gut feeling had become a roaring alarm that I couldn't ignore any longer. As I sat there in the darkness of our living room, staring at the glowing screen that offered a window into her deceit, I felt a mix of shock, anger, and a profound sorrow that threatened to crush me. Every promise we'd made, every tender moment we'd shared, was now tainted by the realization that I'd been deceived in plain sight. And amid that overwhelming turmoil, I knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. I could feel the weight of my own thoughts, the truth that was unfolding before me, as I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation. The next step was both terrifying and necessary. I had to face her, demand the truth, and find out how the woman I loved could betray me so completely. And so, in the silence of that fateful night, with only the hum of my racing heart for company, I set the stage for a reckoning that would forever alter the course of my life. After that fateful night when I first noticed the strange spikes on the tracking app, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Every day since then, I found myself compulsively checking the app, refreshing the map and comparing timestamps, as if each update might finally offer a clear explanation. At first, I tried to convince myself that these anomalies were nothing more than technical glitches, an error in the GPS coordinates or a miscalculation in the system. After all, technology isn't perfect, right? But as the days turned into weeks, the discrepancies became too consistent to dismiss. I began to dig deeper into the app's logs. There were specific intervals when the location would abruptly jump from our familiar neighborhoods to an area I'd never seen her visit before, a part of town that was far removed from the usual stops like the gym, our favorite coffee shop, or even the local park. The app showed that her phone was signaling at precisely the same off-route location multiple times in a single week. My mind started racing with possibilities, none of which felt right. I felt a slow, sinking realization building inside me: this wasn't a mere accident or an app malfunction, it was something deliberate. One evening, after another sleepless night punctuated by anxious thoughts, I decided to match the geolocation data with our shared calendar and recent conversations. I scribbled down every address and time that the app indicated, cross-referencing them against the routine she claimed to uphold. Almost immediately, a pattern emerged. There were regular occurrences when her location strayed inexplicably far from our home. Each time, when I casually questioned her later, she offered short, curt answers: "I had some errands," or "I was meeting a friend." Her tone was dismissive, and her eyes, whenever they met mine briefly, seemed to glint with a secret that I wasn't allowed to know. The more I compared the data, the more the truth began to crystallize in my mind. One particular day stands out: the app recorded her presence at an unfamiliar upscale district on the other side of town at an hour when I knew she was supposedly at a local boutique meeting with a client. I waited until the evening, and when she arrived home late, her usual excuse being just a quick meeting, I couldn't help but confront my own doubts. I asked her casually about her day, but her response was vague and overly rehearsed, as though she'd practiced it multiple times before. The lie felt as flimsy as paper, yet she delivered it with a nonchalant ease that both infuriated and frightened me. My heart pounded and my palms started to sweat as I began to suspect that the truth was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. With every new anomaly on the map, every unexpected ping from a part of town I couldn't place, I felt the grip of betrayal tighten around my throat. I started saving screenshots of the unusual location logs and even downloaded the raw data from the app. Every line of data, every timestamp became a piece of an ever-growing puzzle, a puzzle that, when completed, would reveal a secret far more sinister than I could have ever anticipated. The turning point came one cool autumn morning. I woke up early, determined to compare the app's data against her social media activity. I discovered that on several occasions, she had posted photos or status updates that corresponded with the locations marked on the tracking app, but with one glaring exception: the content of those posts didn't match the persona she had let me see. Instead of casual, everyday snapshots from the gym or our favorite coffee spot, there were images of her in luxurious settings, lavish restaurants, and sometimes even wearing outfits that screamed sophistication far beyond what she ever needed for our routine life. The posts were sporadic, almost as if they were meant for someone's eyes only. My pulse raced as I realized that she was living a double life, one that I had never been invited into. Another incident solidified my growing conviction. On a rainy Friday, while I was at the shop, I got an unexpected call from a mutual friend who casually mentioned that he'd seen her with a group of colleagues at a high-end bar in a part of town I knew nothing about. Initially, I thought it was just a social outing, nothing unusual for a charismatic woman like her. But when I checked the tracking app later that night, I noticed that her location had indeed shifted dramatically that evening. The evidence was mounting, each piece more damning than the last, and I could no longer pretend that my gut instincts were misguided. I spent countless hours, with a mix of growing dread and a desperate need to understand, piecing together the information. I compared her pretext with the geographic evidence, each mismatch stoking the flames of betrayal in my heart. Every time her phone's location deviated from our normal routine, I felt as though a part of my world was crumbling. In those moments, I wondered how someone I had trusted so completely could conceal a secret that was laid bare by the unforgiving logic of technology. Finally, the undeniable truth began to sink in: she was deceiving me. The realization that the woman I had built my life around had been using my trust as a shield for her own hidden escapades was both devastating and infuriating. Every piece of data, every location anomaly, confirmed that she was intentionally lying about her whereabouts. The geolocation data wasn't just numbers on a screen, it was a cold, impersonal testimony to the betrayal that now defined our relationship. In that harrowing moment of clarity, as I stared at the screen and saw the digital trail of evidence laid out before me, I felt a surge of emotions that was almost overwhelming. My heart ached with sorrow, my mind reeled in disbelief, and a simmering anger began to replace the initial shock. I knew I had to confront her, to demand an explanation for the elaborate web of deception that had been spun around me. The tracking app, which I had once viewed as a benign tool for safety, had transformed into a veritable witness, one that would not let her lies hide the truth any longer. That day, as I gathered the screenshots and prepared my silent dossier of proof, I vowed that I would no longer be the passive recipient of her carefully orchestrated lies. I felt an intense need to reclaim my dignity and hold her accountable for the breach of trust that had shaken the very core of my existence. The discovery had sparked a determination in me that was as frightening as it was empowering. If she could use technology to lie to me, then I would use the same technology as the key to unmasking every facet of her betrayal. By the end of that week, I was no longer the naive husband who accepted her vague explanations or deflected my concerns with casual dismissals. The evidence was undeniable, and the digital footprints left on that tracking app told a story of deceit, secrecy, and a life lived in parallel, hidden from my view. I realized that confronting her was no longer a choice, but an imperative, a step toward understanding the full extent of the betrayal and reclaiming the control I thought I had lost. As I sat back in the quiet of our living room that night, surrounded by the soft glow of the tracking app screen and the harsh light of unvarnished truth, I felt a profound shift within me. The innocent trust one had once placed in our shared life was now a relic of a past that no longer existed. I had become a man armed with digital evidence, ready to face the painful confrontation that awaited me, a confrontation that promised to tear down the facade of our life, exposing the raw, unfiltered truth of her indiscretions. The day of the confrontation came sooner than I expected. After nights of agonizing over the mounting digital proof and days filled with restless anticipation, I knew that I had to face the truth head-on. With a heavy heart and a folder full of screenshots printed from the tracking app, I prepared myself for the moment that would shatter all pretenses and bring every hidden lie into the light. I remember that morning clearly. I had barely slept, my mind was a jumble of emotions, rage, hurt, disbelief, and a bitter determination to reclaim the control that had been snatched from me. I stood by the door of our bedroom, rehearsing what I would say. My hands trembled as I clutched those printed logs, each one a testament to the secret locations where Claire had been when she claimed to be elsewhere. Every glaring discrepancy, every off-route marker on the map, burned into my memory. Later that afternoon, as the sunlight filtered dimly through our living room windows, I found her curled up on the sofa with her laptop, her usual excuse for catching up on work or having some me time. Her eyes flickered away from the screen when she noticed me approaching. It was as if she had known this moment would come. I cleared my throat and said, as steadily as I could manage, "Claire, we need to talk, seriously." She looked up at me with an expression that was a mix of annoyance and impatience. "Mike, can't we just relax?" "I'm in the middle of something important," she replied, her tone light but laced with that familiar condescension that always made me feel small. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us, its contents hidden behind the cover for a moment before I slowly revealed the first page. "Explain these," I demanded, my voice low and taut with barely contained anger. "This is your phone's location at 2:13 p.m. on Tuesday, an area that is nowhere near the gym, the coffee shop, or even the grocery store. Where exactly were you?" Her eyes darted to the page, and for a split second, I caught a flash of irritation before she masked it with a smirk. "Mike, you know these apps are never 100% accurate. It could be a glitch," she said dismissively, leaning back as if the evidence before us were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I wasn't buying it. "A glitch? Then why do I see the same pattern every single day?" I countered sharply. "At least 3 times last week, the app shows you at a location you've never even mentioned. Every time I asked, you brushed it off. Now I have these screenshots, every one of them. They're not mistakes. They show exactly where you've been." Her dismissive smirk wavered for a moment, replaced by a look of feigned confusion. "Mike, you're overreacting. Everyone has moments when their phone's location might be off." "It doesn't mean I'm doing anything inappropriate," she replied, her tone suddenly defensive, as if trying to bury the growing evidence with feigned innocence. "Overreacting?" I said, my voice rising with every word. "I trusted you, Claire. I trusted you completely. And you've been out there, repeatedly, in places you never mentioned to me. Your excuses, just running errands, meeting a friend, don't add up when the map clearly shows you somewhere else entirely." I thrust the folder forward, sliding more pages in her direction. She snatched the papers from my hand for a split second, her eyes scanning over the data. When she looked back at me, there was a moment of panic in her expression before it was replaced by a cool, almost mocking smile. "So, what? You think I'm cheating on you just because the app shows me someplace different?" "That's absurd, Mike," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You and your tracking apps have always been a bit paranoid." I took a step closer, my anger now mixing with deep hurt. "Paranoid? Claire, look at these times and locations. I've cross-checked them with our plans, with your calls. They don't match up with the story you've been telling me." I paused, struggling for a moment as my throat tightened. "Tell me the truth. I need to understand why you're lying about where you've been." Her eyes narrowed, and for a long, tense moment, she said nothing. Then, with a sigh that sounded more like resignation than apology, she replied, "Maybe you're just not supportive enough, Mike. Maybe if you paid more attention to me rather than obsessing over your stupid little gadgets, I wouldn't have to do what I did." Her tone was casual, as if admitting to something trivial, as if our marriage were just an inconvenience in her life. "Not supportive enough?" I repeated, struggling to suppress a mix of disbelief and fury. "Is this about feeling neglected? Because it sure feels like you've been lying to me for months about your whereabouts. And now you suggest it's my fault?" I was shaking with the force of the betrayal. "How can you justify this by turning it into a matter of support? I never once believed you'd betray me, not like this." She rolled her eyes, her posture shifting as if to dismiss the conversation altogether. "Mike, you're always so dramatic," she snapped. "Maybe if you learned to relax and trust me a little, you wouldn't be digging into your phone every minute. I have a life, you know, one that isn't just about you and your expectations." I slammed my hand on the table, causing the folder to jump slightly. "A life? What kind of life can you lead on the side while pretending our life is all that matters to you? You've been lying, Claire. Every excuse, every fabricated story, and now I have proof that you were somewhere else, over and over again." My voice broke, edged with a bitterness that cut deep. "I trusted you with everything, and you've taken that trust and tossed it aside like it was nothing." Her face contorted for a split second, the mask of nonchalance cracking to reveal something akin to guilt before she quickly composed herself. "Look, Mike," she said, her voice softer now, "things aren't always black and white. Sometimes, you need to do what's best for yourself." It wasn't an apology, not even a hint of remorse, it was a justification, a rationalization of her actions that left me cold. I took a deep breath, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. I realized then that this confrontation wasn't merely about the tracking data or the lie I had uncovered. It was a collision of everything I had ever believed about our love, our commitment, and our shared future. "I need the truth, Claire," I said, trying to steady my voice despite the storm raging within. "Tell me why you're really out there, why you've been deliberately hiding your whereabouts. Was it just to feel wanted? Or is there someone else?" For a long moment, silence fell between us as she stared at the floor, her eyes avoiding mine entirely. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Maybe there is someone else, Mike. Or maybe I just needed something different." The admission was so vague, so devoid of the remorse I expected, that it drove a jagged edge through my heart. I felt the crushing weight of her indifference, her ability to reduce this profound betrayal to a bland explanation. "Different?" I repeated, incredulous. "You call infidelity different? What about the promises we made? The trust one placed in you?" My words were laced with a raw, aching anger. "I deserve an answer. I deserve to know exactly what this means." At that moment, the room felt unbearably small, as if the walls were closing in on me. Claire looked up, her eyes cold and unapologetic. "Maybe you deserve it, Mike. Maybe you should have paid more attention, instead of relying on apps and data to keep track of me." Her tone was mocking, as if suggesting that all of this was somehow my fault. It was a final, cutting remark that left no room for further discussion. I stood there, my heart pounding with a mixture of fury and shattered hope. "You know what, Claire?" I said, my voice trembling but determined. "I've gathered every bit of evidence, from the tracking logs to your hollow excuses. I know exactly where you've been and what you've done. And I promise you this, I'm not going to let you get away with it." Every word was a vow, a declaration that I would no longer be the victim of your deception. The confrontation had evolved beyond mere accusations, it had become a battle for my dignity and self-respect. I realized then that I wasn't just confronting a lie, I was confronting the very person I had once loved. And in that moment, with the tangible evidence spread out between us, I knew that nothing could ever restore the trust that had been so callously shattered. As I turned away from her, my mind swirling with the gravity of her betrayal, I felt an overwhelming resolve begin to form within me. The hurt was raw, and the anger was potent, but beneath it all was the realization that I had to take control of my life from this point forward. I left the living room that day knowing that this confrontation was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain, but I promised myself that I wouldn't be defined by this betrayal. I would find a way to rebuild what was left of my dignity and, if I had to, seek retribution for the lies I had been forced to endure. After the confrontation, I was left reeling in a storm of heartbreak, anger, and disbelief. The weight of Melissa's lies pressed down on me every moment. I spent countless sleepless nights in our silent home, each room echoing memories of better times that now felt tainted by betrayal. Even while working in the garage, a temporary escape where the steady hum of machinery briefly drowned out my thoughts, the raw pain of realizing my trust had been so carelessly shattered lingered in every moment. I sought solace in solitude and tried to piece together my shattered sense of self through long, reflective drives and quiet moments spent alone with my thoughts. However, the emotional aftermath was relentless. Every reminder of her whereabouts, a misaligned location on my tracking app, a dismissed phone call, or her smug glance, rekindled that agony. The betrayal was not only in the data but in the cold indifference with which Melissa brushed off my concerns. In those dark days, I started writing down every thought in a worn journal. Each written line was a small step toward understanding the extent of my pain. I vowed that I wouldn't let this betrayal define me completely, even as it rewrote the narrative of our marriage in a language of deceit and disregard. The hurt was profound and persistent, yet beneath it all, a fierce determination began to take root, signaling that nothing, even a trust so thoroughly broken, could keep me from reclaiming my dignity. As the days turned into weeks, my raw emotions began to coalesce into a stark decision: I could no longer allow Melissa's deception to control my life. With every new piece of evidence from the tracking app and every dismissive excuse she offered, I recognized that I owed it to myself to reclaim not just my dignity, but also a sense of justice. I made my choice one cold morning while staring blankly at my phone. The data was irrefutable: Melissa had been lying, and my trust was utterly betrayed. Determined not to remain a helpless victim, I resolved that revenge was necessary, not to destroy her, but to force her to face the consequences of her actions. I began planning a series of actions designed to expose her hypocrisy and restore my sense of control. Simple yet calculated, my plan involved collecting every shred of evidence, leveraging it in subtle ways to upend her carefully constructed facade of arrogance and denial. I reached out to a few trusted friends who, shocked by her betrayal, lent me support and advice. Their encouragement fueled my newfound resolve. I started acting decisively, letting her know, through quiet, measured gestures and pointed comments, that the era of her lies was over. Every action was a step towards balancing the scales. This wasn't about destruction for its own sake, it was about reclaiming a life ruined by deceit and ensuring she could no longer hide behind her fabricated excuses. In the end, the journey through betrayal, heartbreak, and revenge transformed me in unexpected ways. The bitter lessons learned from Melissa's infidelity, confirmed by cold digital evidence, reshaped my understanding of trust, loyalty, and self-respect. I no longer idealized our past; each broken promise was now a reminder of the value of honesty. Though the scars of betrayal remain, I now see them as marks of survival and hard-won wisdom. I have learned that sometimes, the only way to heal is to confront the harsh truth and reclaim your power, even if it means exacting a measured revenge to ensure justice is served. My advice, born out of raw experience, is to trust your instincts, insist on transparency, and never allow yourself to be diminished by someone else's duplicity. Today, as I rebuild my life from these ruins, I look forward with cautious hope. Each new day is a step towards regaining what was lost: a newfound strength, an unwavering commitment to self-respect, and the understanding that even the deepest wounds can eventually give rise to a brighter, more honest future. The journey has been painful, but it has also made me more resilient than I ever thought possible.